Alright, in this video we want to cover modern evolutionary theory. We're going to update Darwin. Darwin really didn't understand anything about genetics, how traits were actually passed from parents to offspring. So in the 20th century, when we sort of rediscovered Mendel and thought about how genes were passed, and we also combined that with Darwinian evolutionary theory, we sort of came up with our modern definition of evolution, which is just talking about how the population is changing. We're saying that more specifically, evolution is when the gene pool of a population shifts in some kind of way over the generations. And so just to show you an example of that, what if we knew the genotypes of all organisms in a particular area, so a population, and all a gene pool is considering all of their alleles kind of at the same time. So if we could literally count all of the capital R's, as I'll do here, we could say that 7 of the 40 R's that are here are uppercase, so 17.5%. That leaves the other 33 to be recessive, so 82%. And if we could come back to that population a few generations later and we perhaps notice that it's different, maybe say 5 generations later, we have a count like this. We see far more capital R's than lowercase r's, then we say that the gene pool has shifted, and we say that evolution must be causing that. So that's all evolution really is. If you saw in that last slide that most of the alleles or most of the organisms showed the recessive phenotype, sometimes students sort of ask a question like, so does that allele become dominant because most of the organisms have it? And so I just want to try and avoid the confusion. Genetic dominance and genetic recessiveness is different from how widespread an allele is in the gene pool. Remember that all that it means to be genetically dominant is if you have an organism that's heterozygous and has both alleles, then the dominant allele will show up in the phenotype, essentially. So something can be genetically dominant and yet not very widespread in the gene pool because maybe an evolutionary force is not increasing it very much. So just as a quick example, in humans, polydactyly is actually genetically dominant. Having more than 5 fingers is genetically dominant. Having 5 fingers is genetically recessive. And yet 99% of us are homozygous recessive for that particular gene. So just because something's dominant or recessive doesn't mean it's widespread. The evolutionary forces will control how widespread something is. So there are 5 evolutionary forces, and we'll walk through them one by one in this video. And what I really just want to emphasize is what makes each one of them different and how they're changing the gene pool. So let's start with one that we're already familiar with. Natural selection is really the same story as it was in Darwin's system. It's simply the idea that some genes and their alleles might cause organisms to have phenotypes that help them survive and reproduce better. So let's say that the gene pool starts like this, just like before, but maybe the environment shifts such that the dominant phenotype actually gives a survival advantage. So maybe these organisms, a lot of these organisms who show the recessive phenotype don't survive to reproduce any offspring, so I'm going to remove them from our gene pool here. And let's say that the remaining organisms can kind of pair up. I'm assuming a population that reproduces sexually here. Let's say that they produce these offspring. I tried to kind of look at each one and roughly predict what a Punnett square might predict in terms of their offspring. And if we were to recount the capital R's and lowercase r's of all of the new generation, we would see that they're different from the previous generation, so evolution by natural selection has occurred. So as we've seen before, natural selection is simply when some organisms with certain phenotypes reproduce more than others, and over generations that causes a significant shift. As you will see in a lab activity, natural selection very rarely eliminates alleles completely, even if they're extremely maladaptive, especially alleles that are recessive, something I'm going to want you to show. So let's talk about sexual selection. It's another type of selection, so it also involves differential reproduction, but for a different reason. Perhaps some phenotypes help organisms win mates more successfully and therefore reproduce more. So maybe the dominant phenotype here is something like a sexier song, if you're thinking of like a songbird species. Maybe some birds sing away genetically that help them attract mates better. And so let's say that a lot of organisms flock to the organism with the dominant phenotype and reproduce with them. Let's say that the remaining unpaired organisms organisms here at the recessive phenotype are unsuccessful at reproducing at all, so they don't reproduce any organisms or pass on their genes. Let's say that the remaining pairs here produce offspring somewhat according to what a Punnett square might predict. If I counted up all the capital and lowercase r's once again, we see a shift away from the recessive allele slightly and toward the dominant allele. So both of them involve differential reproduction, sexual and natural selection, but for different reasons. If phenotypes help you survive to reproduce more, natural selection. If phenotypes help you win mates more often, sexual selection. Great. Let's move on. Let's talk about gene flow. Another reason that a gene pool might change is because organisms might leave or come into the population from a different area, and they bring in or take away their alleles with them. So let's just show a bunch of organisms maybe migrating away from the current population, going somewhere else. If we were to sort of recount the alleles of the remaining population, maybe they're different from the original population, and so that's evolution. So it can involve organisms coming into the population as well. They obviously have to be of the same species in order to mix and reproduce. So, and something that we'll see in Chapter 24, oftentimes a lack of gene flow or greatly reduced gene flow between two groups, if they're not meeting together and reproducing as much, that might be sort of putting them on the road to become different species from each other. But we'll see that more a little bit later. So let's talk about genetic drift. Genetic drift is often misunderstood by students, so I really want to emphasize this one. Genetic drift at its heart is any time the allele frequencies change due to randomness, some kind of random force causing a shift over generations. So that could be a lot of different things. That could be sort of the massive death of a lot of organisms randomly, say due to a natural disaster. Some kind of flood comes in and destroys a lot of organisms. The organisms that survive don't survive because they have like genetic genes that help them resist floods. They're just lucky, right? And so the new gene pool would look like this, significantly different perhaps from the original population. So that would just be one example of a random event causing a shift. What I just described is sometimes called a bottleneck effect. That's one type of genetic drift, although not all genetic drift is due to bottlenecks. Sometimes you might just have a very small group who goes and sort of gets started somewhere completely different, separate from the original population, say on like an island. And the reason why that's not gene flow is maybe we're assuming that population had never been on that island before, that species had never been on that island. So because they're a fairly small group, they might be genetically different overall from the original population, so they've already started to become significantly different just due to random genetic drift. But it doesn't even have to involve those two. Sometimes just the randomness of sexual reproduction can create differences. Punnett squares help us predict what ought to occur in the next generation, but sometimes, if you're supposed to produce a certain percentage of phenotypes in your offspring, sometimes each offspring might be different from what is predicted by a Punnett square. So something I want you to show in a lab activity coming up is that the smaller a population is, the greater the random change due to genetic drift. A smaller sample size has more of a risk of having events due to random chance than, say, a bigger sample size. Something else you'll want to see is that genetic drift might even cause entire alleles to be lost if there's a drastic enough random event. Good. So let's finish with mutation. Mutation simply creates new alleles. So what if our population maybe just had one allele to begin with? What if they were all recessive? And then in the next generation, some kind of founding mutation created the dominant allele in one organism to start with. So we would say that the gene pool has changed due to mutation. As you can see, mutation doesn't change the gene pool very much by itself. Other evolutionary forces will typically act on the allele from there to either increase it or reject it or decrease it. All mutation does is create the alleles in the first place. Just a reminder that if a mutation is really going to be passed on, it has to, and the mutation's getting the allele started, then the mutation has to be in a germline cell, so it's passed on to the offspring. All right, so we've talked about the modern definition of evolution, and we've talked about 5 different ways evolution can occur, not just natural selection.